First, I want to thank you for the introduction and thank Carol Garrison for the invitation to come out here at both departments who sponsor this lecture series. Not only is it nice to be invited to give the lecture and be here at the EKU campus, but also back in my native state. I was born in Kentucky, and I'm actually a Kentucky colonel, which is one of the honors that is not on my introduction, but sort of out of the blue, they decided to make me a Kentucky colonel. I guess their standards slipped. I'm not sure what. I think that entitles me to go to the Derby and drink mint juleps, but I live too far away to go now. So, but I was born in Covington. My family is all from Corbin, Barbourville, and London, not too far from here. So it's great to be back, and I picked a good time to come. It's beautiful out there. I love the trees are all changing colors, and it's nice. Where I live now in Southern California, you kind of have to go to the mountains to see that, you know. We just don't have the same change of seasons. Well, this topic today, wrongful conviction, I'm going to talk about, is something I've been working on now for about the last 15 years or so. Starting back when I was at Ohio State, I had an Israeli PhD student who needed to have a dissertation. And we had a distinguished visiting professor from New York named Ed Sagarin at the time, who's passed away before we wrote our book. But we were, you know, like a lot of good ideas, this idea started at a deli across from campus at lunch one day at Ohio State. And Ed and Artie and I went over there and we said, what's a good topic for his dissertation? We just did some brainstorming over, as I recall, maybe a Reuben sandwich or something. And I think whatever it was I sketched out had some mustard and pickle on it by the time we got done. But, you know, Ed was saying, well, you know, this topic of innocent people that get convicted, there was some early work by Borchardt, but not much has been done in recent decades. And it's really been understudied. We don't know a whole lot about it. It really caught our imagination, and we decided to start working on this. And we've produced a lot of you know, publications and actually also RA's dissertation, and I'll talk a little bit about that survey that we did in a minute. But it's back in the news quite a bit now. It's getting more attention than it used to. And I always like to say that this whole idea of wrongful conviction extends way back in our history, of course, before we were a nation. Because the colonists in the United States, under the British, were subject to secret accusations. And of course, that was long before we had our Constitution and Bill of Rights. So one can only speculate how many people were wrongfully convicted in those days, because you know, you just didn't have much of a chance to defend yourself. The status differences in the colonies were not as important as they were in England, but in some colonies they were still quite important, especially in Virginia. Status was a big thing. And so we can only imagine that because of the inferior social status assigned to some people, particularly blacks, at that time in history, that many of them probably were wrongfully convicted, although we have no actual data, nor do we still today have any definitive data. So of course we still have that kind of discrimination, and in a number of these cases we see that still plays a role. But today I'm not going to talk about the colonial history so much. I'm just going to talk about more contemporary problems. I mentioned that the first study that was really done on this in the U.S. was by Borchardt in 1932. And about 7 decades ago, and so there's this sort of gap in the literature, for about half a century, whenever we did have anybody writing on this, they just kind of talked about individual cases in a one-by-one sort of discussion. But starting in the 90s and continuing for about the last 10 or 12 years, we've had a real shift in the scholarly research as well as the media attention and public opinion. The importance of this as a public policy issue has grown a lot in the United States. A lot of the reason for that is DNA. And you know, this sort of is catching the fancy of the American people in a lot of ways. What's the #1 television show? Not your personal #1. Anybody know what the #1 rated television show is? CSI. And it has been for quite a while. And they try to be pretty realistic. You know, I live 70 miles from Hollywood, and you know, they take their own license with these shows, right? But at least CSI they try to use science, and they try to be somewhat realistic about it. I didn't have a chance to tell Carol this story yet, but the American Society of Criminology As he mentioned, I was president of that a couple years ago, and the headquarters of the American Society of Criminology is on the edge of the Ohio State campus, where Carol and I met, actually. And Sarah Hall is a woman who's the administrator. She's been there forever. In fact, I helped hire her in 1976. So Sarah tells me one day she's sitting in the office and the phone rings and the person says, "Are you the administrator of the American Society of Criminology?" She said, "Yes. We understand that you publish the Journal of Criminology and that that's the best journal in the field in the world." And she said, "Yeah, we do, and thank you for saying that. We think it is. Well, we'd like to order 6 copies." And she said, well, who am I talking to? And they said, "This is the production staff for CSI." They said, "We want to put this on his bookshelf on the show so it looks like he's doing his homework, you know." So at least they're at that level of detail trying to do their research. And so Sarah was happy to send them the copies free of charge. But in addition to these shows that are sort of looking at science and its role in criminology and criminal justice, you all are familiar with the moratorium on the death penalty that Governor Ryan imposed in Illinois. And he did that because there was a period of time where more people on death row were exonerated than had their convictions affirmed. There's 27 cases, 14 were cleared, and only 13 were found to have, committed the murders. So this is a major problem. And Governor Ryan said, well, with this kind of error rate, I'm going to put a moratorium on this until we figure out what's going on. And I'll come back to the death penalty a little bit later. In their seminal study in this field, Hugo Bedeau and Michael Radlett argued that at least 23 innocent people have already been executed in the United States since 1900. And some of those cases are in dispute, but I think their article in the Stanford Law Review, as well as their Northeastern University Press book that followed it, make pretty persuasive cases for these wrongful convictions. More recently, in a study of thousands of capital sentences over a 23-year period from 1973 to 1995, Jim Liebman and Jeff Fagan and their colleagues at Columbia University in New York found serious reversible errors in nearly 7 of every 10 cases. The great majority of those who were wrongfully convicted in the United States, of course, are not facing the death penalty or life in prison. But these errors result in many years of unwarranted punishment. A lot of times, as those of us who worked in correctional institutions can tell you, some unpleasant things happen to you when you're in these institutions. Imagine, for example, if you get wrongfully convicted of child molestation or child rape, and you go to prison. Well, as many of you know, the stratification system in prison, the child molesters and child rapists are the lowest on the stratification. They're the most hated people. And if the prisoners can get at them, they often will, and they'll do great bodily harm to them. The next are the rapists, men who rape not children but women. They're also looked at as not real men, and the prisoners hate them. So suppose you're in prison for something like that and you didn't do it. Imagine now you're faced with the injustice of having been convicted for a crime you didn't do. Plus you're in here with all these prisoners that think you did it. And so we had cases that we looked at where these guys were scalded with hot water. They were tortured by other prisoners. They went through a lot of, terrible kinds of trauma while they were in prison. Some of them were in, death row for a long time. I don't know how many of you saw the videotape Thin Blue Line. Anybody see that? Okay. You can rent it at Blockbuster or wherever. It's a great videotape. It won several awards. The producer of that videotape went to Texas to do a story on a guy named Dr. Grigson, whose nickname was Dr. Death, because the Texas Department of Corrections, before they executed somebody, they had this guy interview them to see if they were actually, psychiatrically certified to be executed. And he certified everyone. He never found anybody that wasn't eligible to be executed. So he got the nickname Dr. Death. So they went down there, this producer did, and later 60 Minutes did. They wanted to do something on Dr. Death. Producer ran into this guy named Randall Adams, who I later came to know real well. He's from Columbus, Ohio, where I was living.